unusual sighting amazed many people. In the middle 40s, a man called William Shaver had written to Palmer about his alleged visit to a subterranean culture, peopled by beings he referred to as DEROs and TEROs. What he wrote was to create another legend of UFO mythology.
Briefly, it was the story of a radioactive flare from the sun around 12,000 years ago, which virtually wiped out life on Earth. And the survivors fled into space in spaceships, while the persons left behind, whom he called abandoned DERO, went into the cavern world and set up a civilization there, which from that time on became contaminated because the atmosphere had to be drawn from the surface and so on in the water. So they gradually degenerated into what he called DEROs, D meaning detrimental or destructive, and ro being a shortening of robot or robotic. In other words, he felt that these people were mentally controlled by robotic DERO influences. In other words, the radioactivity in their brain made them insane. But they had at their access the wonderful machines left by this civilization which fled the Earth, which had been taken down into the caves. And among them was a craft they called a rolat. Ro again for robotically controlled, instrumentally controlled, and so on. And in the caves, they used these things, which were discs about 30 feet in diameter, to go through tunnels and the tortuous caves underneath the ground for hundreds of miles, even from continent to continent. And they were controlled automatically so they did not touch the floor, the ceiling, or the walls. And therefore, they had this flipping motion, and they went through caves where they had a right-angle turn. They traveled around 1,200 miles an hour. When Shaver heard about Kenneth Arnold's sighting, he wrote me very triumphantly and said, "You see, these rolats do come out of the caves."
Perhaps the greatest surprise was when Arnold reported his sighting to the nearest U.S. military airbase. He found on the wall of the commander's office this classified gun sight photograph, which bore a remarkable resemblance to what Arnold claimed he had just seen, and Shaver had discussed 3 years before. Something else Ken Arnold didn't know was that Dr. Hynek was officially researching UFOs for the U.S. Air Force and compiling a classified report known as Project Sign, later to become known as Project Blue Book.
Well, it was as an astronomer that I first became associated with the UFO problem. In 1948, the Air Force asked me, as an astronomer, to assist them in seeing how many of the reports on flying saucers that were coming in at that time could be explained astronomically. And one thing led to another, and I became scientific consultant to the Air Force and remained so for some 20 years. I started almost as a complete skeptic because I thought the whole thing was a question of post-war nerves, but it was the persistence of the phenomenon, it refused to dry up and blow away, that finally led me to the belief that we had a real phenomenon to deal with.
Well, it was on the 6th of January 1968, just by the edge of the riverbank near this golf course, that I witnessed the landing of no less than 2 flying saucers. A negative craft and a good guy's craft. There are both good guys and bad guys. And the whole thing started off when the State Electricity Commission built a 66,000-volt power station next door to my home. And these attracted the flying saucers, which came and had a look at it while it was in its construction stages. And when it was switched on especially, they came around in droves, measuring the magnetic fields around it. In those days, in 1968, we had Essendon Airport in Melbourne. Tullamarine hadn't been built, and aircraft took off like flocks of birds all over the place. And this particular plane had to bank on this evening, the 6th of the 1st, 68, in order to miss this flying saucer, which then, after it left the paper mills, trundled off across the sky over here to the Kew Boulevard. So I had my camera loaded up with 400 ASA black and white 8mm film, and I took it and followed this UFO down by the roadside, by the river, and I got some spectacular film of a landing. I had a sudden impression to look up, and lo and behold, this light in the sky was getting bigger and bigger, and I realized it was going to land. And it did land, But I was so surprised because watching a UFO land isn't any normal event. I was so surprised I didn't get a picture of the first landing, and just as well because this was a landing by the men in black, what we know as the negative flying saucers. But after I'd recovered from my surprise, I did get enough gumption to photograph the second UFO, which came from Ashtar Command, which was in hot pursuit of this first UFO, and this is the one that landed in the movie film I took. Now, 10 years later, this is the spot where the flying saucer landed, and I revisited the location, and this is an approximate angle of what I shot on my movie film 10 years later on today. This picture was taken the morning after the landing. It left a burnt circle 60 feet big in the grass. This second picture was taken 7 years later of the same burnt circle, and as you see, nothing has grown on the spot. Well, now, let's take a look at the burnt circle 10 years later and see whether or not anything has grown. Yes, well, this is the burnt circle. A lot of flying saucer landings leave burnt circles, and nothing has grown on this one since the original landing on that particular night. And over the years, we've come back to the boulevard and checked this area and found no growth on the burnt circle.
Along with Shaver, Colin Cameron claims to have had contact with the subterranean DEROs and TEROs here in Australia. This belief should not be dismissed too lightly. Ray Palmer came out with some astonishing details about Shaver's experience.
I think Mr. Shaver, well, he originally claimed that he spent 8 years in these caves with these DERO and TERO people, T being integrative. And I discovered later, much to my embarrassment, that he had spent these 8 years in the Ypsilanti State Hospital for the Insane in Michigan. I contacted the doctors, and they said he was catatonic. He lived in a world, they even had to feed him, in this imaginary world of his. Except for one thing, when Kenneth Arnold saw the flying saucers, I put together 2 and 2, and I said, is the man catatonic, or is there something else going on? But I got 50,000 letters. We ordinarily get 50 or 60 a month, from people who said, Mr. Shaver is telling the truth. And not only that, I have been in the caves too, and I hear the voices.
I've been hearing these voices now for about the next 7 years onwards, every night. And until I started taking some infrared film, which I'd read in a book by, can't think of his name now, but Trevor James. And he had, at the suggestion of Ashtar Space Command, taken infrared photography and got these invisible flying saucers. So I thought, well, as these entities were invisible and they were bothering me, I'd try some infrared film too. And that's where I got these pictures of these entities. And after those nights, what was happening to me was I was starting to hear these voices, just like Shaver was, saying I was going to die, saying they were going to get me, saying they wanted to stop me researching into flying saucers, and generally trying to terrify me. But I was never scared throughout the whole thing. This is what's kept me going.
As we were about to finish this documentary, another intriguing explanation of UFOs was given to us by an ex-FBI informer, now living in Perth. A research physicist, what he has to say is what he believes to be the truth. It is so staggering, we felt we should extend this program so that he could be heard. This scientist believes that man holds the secret of anti-gravity and can produce flying saucers at will. We interviewed him at a private house in Perth.
Well, originally I didn't start to investigate UFO phenomenon. I suppose I started studying the physics that led me to this point, 62 to 64, at the United States Air Force Academy as a cadet in a special government program. As you're aware, the Air Force Academy is outside NORAD in the Colorado Mountains. It's a few miles up the hill from it. And I was trained there with 180 some odd other characters to do research in areas of electrogravitics. Later, we were programmed with libraries of information by slides flashed up on a wall at the rate of 200 pages a second. We couldn't even read them, but they were being implanted in our minds subliminally. It was a very classified project, and for the most part of it, while we were being programmed, we weren't aware of what was going on. We had normal classes in physics and calculus and this sort of things, but this stuff was being programmed in so that we had to assimilate it or bring it to our conscious mind over the months and years that followed in dreams and kind of daydream periods during the day when we're awake. But I left the academy in 64. I had a top secret security clearance with the government, and then eventually that lapsed to secret. And I did a bit of time in the reserves, Air Force Reserves, with the Strategic Air Command outside of Fort Worth. And then proceeded to do private research in this electrogravitics, thinking that I had cracked the secret of anti-gravity all by myself, and jumping up and down in my father's labs and mines in Dallas. And one day I was approached by the government and a kind of an emissary from Dr. Edward Teller's office, Dr. James R. Maxfield. And he told me what I'd been doing in my lab and the details of stuff I haven't even written down or told anybody. He knew, and he had other people like myself sponsored in this kind of research around the country. And that was the first time that I knew that the U.S. government was actively involved, had been, and was still actively involved in the control of gravity with electricity.
And who did this man represent?
Well, his job, as his job qualification is he's the director of the James R. Maxfield Radiation Research Clinic in Dallas, Texas. The same Maxfield that invented the irradiated thread treatment for cancer of various organs. If you look at his little dossier that's in the Who's Who, you find that he was on the President's National Security Advisory Board, which is really a rather important log in the U.S. intelligence system. Kissinger would have been on the same rank. You find that he was closely affiliated with Dr. Edward Teller, who was the kind of dubbed the father of the hydrogen bomb project in the United States, but he told me that Dr. Teller was the head of anti-gravity research there, had been, I don't know whether he still is, and that he had worked on a similar project with him. In fact, the letter that you and I viewed earlier from my files from Dr. Maxfield to this government and to Sir John Williams did mention that fact, if you recall.
So what happened to you then?
Well, they suggested that I finish my research in Australia. I wasn't enthralled with the idea, but Dr. Maxfield told me that I would be paid to come down, and that I was to call the Australian consulate in San Francisco and ask for Bob Gray, and tell him that, in these words, that I was a member of Maxfield's party. At the same time that I was being approached by Dr. Maxfield's party to come down here and finish my research, I'd been approached already by the FBI and was working for them as an informant. That doesn't mean that you're a trained agent. It just means that you're somewhere in industry where they need someone. They don't have time to get them in there.
Informing on what?
Well, the particular thing I was to inform on was the comings and goings of various people from the White House to my group of companies in Dallas, and also their connection to Israel and the Middle East political situation. And I did my job rather well, just reporting who came and went and various amounts of money and things that I did know that transferred. There were about 700 or 800 of us in the United States that were employed by the FBI in this manner. I didn't take money, I took information in exchange. But at any rate, they came and told me, the FBI did, that I had been compromised by a break-in in one of their agencies in Louisiana or someplace like that, and that I was going to get shot, and which they'd explained to me at the beginning, the risks involved, but I thought they were joking until I went back to the office, the computer division there in Dallas, and was sacked, given 30 minutes to clean up my desk and leave, and by an old friend of mine. And so he accused me of being the head of a big spy ring and all kinds of stuff. And so I left. And in fact, I didn't have my last meeting with the FBI, and I didn't have my last meeting with Dr. Maxfield. I just bundled a few things and the family into a plane and headed for Australia. I did make it, and I was quite glad to, and kept a very low profile for 7 months. But I continued to do my research, and I wrote Dr. Maxfield a letter, and that was perhaps my mistake. I said, look, I've done it. I've figured out the wave equation that we were looking for. And again, in my ignorance, I didn't realize how much work had already been done and gone before me. I was just kind of on the periphery or the edge of this whole development.
That's a device to be able to make things like flying saucers fly, is it?
Yes. Also, it's a device to store energy in the form of motion, like of a small star or a big atom. It's called, this is a long word, an MHD plasma, magnetohydrodynamic plasma, like ball lightning, and it contains itself. But it's a way to turn all sorts of electricity into a high voltage battery. Now, this would have been an immediate solution for the Middle East oil blockade at that time. Now, I wrote the letter in good faith, trying to say, look, we can stop the threat of war in the Middle East by using this as an alternate energy source. It's very portable, it's non-polluting. It had some byproduct radiation problems, but things we could solve. It would be cleaner than fission or fusion. Now, that's when people here in this country, at the Aeronautical Research Labs, politicians started to get a hold of me. ASIO contacted me. Good grief. An odd infinitum chain of intelligence people, including 2 CIA people from the States. And then the FBI eventually started looking for me in this country, and that again was after the intelligence war over there, after Hoover died. And I was unable to finish my research in this country. In fact, I met many dead ends in government departments and research facilities where they told me privately, like Dr. Tom Keeble in the Aeronautical Research Labs. He told me, yes, we know about the flying saucers your countrymen have built, and in England and in Canada. And in fact, we have film records of them here in the RAAF files. I said, well,
I want to stop you there.
Yeah.
Are you saying, Stan, that there are such things as, let's call them flying saucers, but they are built on Earth?
Yes. That doesn't mean that I rule out the possibility of other flying devices or intelligent beings visiting the planet either from the oceanic bottoms or deeper areas or from other areas in space. But I am positive that we have the technology, I can even name you the companies and people involved, in making high-speed electric aircraft that do look, strange enough, like a saucer.
What sort of proof can one furnish for that?
Oh, good grief. The briefcase I've got down here is full of documented evidence that is not all secret. If you go to the records of the New York Herald Tribune, the newspaper, it's now defunct. I think it's being stored in the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And look for November 20th, 21st, and 22nd, 1955. There are 3 articles in the series on anti-gravity and the various companies and people involved in the research in the United States, Japan, Europe. The list is like a who's who of nuclear physics. It was written by Ansel E. Talbert, the science and aviation editor for the New York Herald Tribune at that time. You can look there. You can look in the electrical engineering index for that period between 55 and 58.
That's a long time ago.
Yes. 57, about March, the security curtain went down. And there were, at that time, over 100 published universities and organizations, including the Gravity Research Foundation, which is still operational in Gravity Village in the United States. There were over 100 of these things operating to develop gravity, the control of it as a power source and communication and locomotion, etc. Now, in 57, the blanket went down on security, and there was no more reported news on it to say either that it was a dead-end research avenue, that everybody had stopped working on it, or that it was highly successful and there had been a few breakthroughs. There was just nothing. It went quiet. And if you go back in the period and look, you will see that for a number of years after 57, there was no mention of this sort of research in print. Behind the scenes, there was a lot of discussion, and even MGM Studios made the movie The Forbidden Planet, revealing at that time a lot, as though it were fiction, of the technology and why it had to be covered up. I think Walter Pidgeon starred in that, and he did a good job.
Prepare your minds for a new scale of physical scientific values, gentlemen.
Basically, they decided that mankind wasn't ready for it yet because he proceeded to misuse it like he had the atom or the hydrogen bomb. Now, recent evidence is very hard to get. However, in this country, a little leak occurred over here with William H. Martin in the Nation Review. May of 1973 or 4, I believe. I can't remember now. He published an article on Pine Gap and how Nixon had intended to use it in 1975 to solve the energy crisis by announcing a new method of electromagnetic propulsion, which would be based from the Pine Gap facility. Well, now, from my knowledge of the technology, what small knowledge I do have from my little viewpoint, Pine Gap has all of the inherent descriptions necessary for a high voltage, low frequency power broadcast station to broadcast electricity to various receivers like cars and submarines and aircraft that are tuned to that power station. It's just a more efficient version of the Exmouth facility here up the Northwest Cape.
So it's right here on our doorstep, is it?
Oh, yes. The big question you have to ask yourself, Guy, is why would such a thing be kept secret? I mean, people at the levels that are covering it up, I know some of them personally, and they aren't, in my opinion, villains. They're very sincere humanists. They are trying to solve planet Earth, trying to bring unity their way.
You speak of them as though they were collective rather than singular. Is that right?
Yes. Dr. Keeble, as I mentioned before, in Melbourne at the Aeronautical Research Lab, tried to explain to me about they. He mentioned we as though it was they. An organization, a group of scientists, academics, industrialists. He couldn't be exact. Now, he never put a name to it, but I said, well, do you mean like a club? And he said, yes, but no. We are aware of these problems, and we're trying to solve them in the best way we know how. Granted, there are things that should be kept from the public eye until we do have some sort of a unity in the world economy. But I think the manner in which it's been gone about is most unfortunate. I would not have taken the same tack myself. The power politics involved in keeping the secrets that we now have across the planet have allowed, well, in my opinion, groups that aren't capable of handling control of the planet to take power.
So what basically you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we've got a situation where you maintain various countries have perhaps a top-level intelligentsia who are in possession of a common set of facts which transpose country boundaries now, and it's a worldwide sort of thing.
In Russia, involved in this would be the Russian physicist who's been in the news recently with the civil rights movements, Dr. Andrei Sakharov. Also in his country, an ex-KGB agent, some 25 years, but a physicist, and a former hydrogen bomb project development engineer, physicist, is Dr. Bruno Pontecorvo, working on gravitic engines in Siberia. As I told you, in the States, it was Dr. Teller and affiliates there. I don't know all of their names. But these people have all been working together as scientists who go above governments. And look, they're sincere. I can't blame them for doing this. It's just that they have lost control of what they tried to set up.
Has that association got a name?
I don't think so. When I worked with the FBI, there was a political and financial institution that I was ordered to investigate with many other agents, and it was called the Illuminati, which is a general term meaning the enlightened or the wise ones. The investigation of this led me to the Council on Foreign Relations and to the Club of Rome, which are linked by joint directorships under Carol Wilson. This is, again, another tale, but you put yourself in the scientist's position in the mid-50s. What you see is that you've got a technology that, if announced to the public, would cause mass reactions in the economy, in social moves, in cultural reactions that could probably bring about the demise of the whole human civilization. A simple example would be this. As a scientist, you come out in the mid-50s and you say, we have a process which will allow us to get rid of tires, allow us to get rid of the petrol engine, hence the petrol, hence all the dependent industries. It'll be available for you in 24 months' time. It'll only cost you $3,000 or $4,000. Now, what guy in his right mind would buy a new petrol engine car if he could have one of the new ones in 2 years that don't need roads and run on electricity and no petrol necessary? They'd all stop their buying trends, which would then collapse the economies that would be building the other one in 24 months. If you had a central world authority, like Dr. Pache's Club of Rome group want, then if you announced, when you controlled all the nations and the economies, if you announced and said, we've got a new car that does this, nobody would panic, because they know that if their industry became redundant, they would be retrained and paid while they're doing it in some other support industry. We don't have that facility on the planet at the moment, because we're greatly disordered, and many of the cultures fight against each other. Scientists, industrialists, engineers found this problem in the mid-50s. Now, we're playing their part. So we sit here and we say, how do we get world unity? The United Nations, the League of Nations had failed. You couldn't get any 2 or 3 of them to agree to turn their sovereignty over to a third party. You couldn't come out and field an army from the United Nations or League of Nations or anywhere, even a corporate army, and tell the people of Earth you're taking over, as some people have suggested the multinationals might do. You can't do that because the mass resistance would be worse than the French resistance to Hitler. It would destroy the unity they were trying to get. So by peaceful discussion over the conference table and by force, it wasn't possible. Yet as the scientific community looked at this new technology, it reached into all human endeavor, touched many points of life. They said, look, if we develop this, completely develop it into a social, technological, integrated model, away from the rest of people in islands or in back rooms, however we do it, keep it quiet even from the politicians. At some point later, after 1956, 57, 58, some point later we'll have it ready to announce to the world as a global system. Then all we've got to do is figure out how to convince them to give it a try in unity.
Right, well this was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Are we now saying that this is approaching the time?
I think we are, and it's not like some prophecy or something. It's just looking at events in the media. For the first 10 years of that 20-year period you're talking about, people that saw UFOs or flying saucers were nuts. They were played that way in the media. It was a bad thing to even talk about it. Now, toward the end of this 20-year period, if you see one, you're a great guy in the neighborhood. Everybody wants to talk to you. Everybody wants to know you. Pilots, physicists, all kinds of people are coming forward now. Presidents, dictators, yes, I've seen a UFO. Now, to me, the shift in the public conditioning medium is to get people ready for the announcement of the new technology. Now, scientists aren't going to come out, industrialists aren't going to come out and say, okay, here it is, children, here you go. The new model for planet Earth using this technology must be independent of any established government or order. It can't be Russian or capitalist or dictatorial. It's got to be independent. And the only way you can do it is an external culture, whether it be called from the ocean bottom, whether it's from the Bermuda Triangle, or whether it's from outer space. They have got to see it in this way so that for a short time, the masses will overlook their cultural differences to unite, to form this one world order. Then, after 7 or 8 years, if you can hold the ruse that long, you explain to them, this is how we brought peace. I still maintain, I don't think that it'll work, because at the top, these organizations are fighting.
I'd like to ask you a direct question. You work in the field of anti-gravitics. Could you make what we call a flying saucer?
Oh, yes, with adequate funds and time, sure. I'd still be doing it for the research organizations if I hadn't differed in philosophy. That's where I got in trouble, because I stood up and said, why are you doing this? And it wasn't for me to know. UFOs if they don't exist, or these electric flying saucers, if they don't exist in our current technology, I'll give it to the world. I'll be a hero, but I'll tell you right now, I don't need to do that. It's already done. This does not mean that in the past, before 47, 49, whenever the first flying saucers were supposedly sighted on this planet, does not mean that the time before that was to be explained by Earth technology. It wasn't. Even back in the Bible, in Moses' encounter with God in the flaming bush, and don't walk on this ground with your shoes on, take one off. It sounded like he was in a field at any rate. Ezekiel's flaming chariot. You go back thousands of years and you find we had encounters with things that could only be explained in their own words as being from the heavens. In the last 2,000 years after the birth of Christ, we find that these encounter cases were, many of them, more bizarre, where they didn't have the same good side to them. People suffered headaches, some cases disappearance, livestock were cut apart and the blood drained out of them. You see it quite frequently now. It seems as though the more recent contact cases from these extraterrestrial origins have been malevolent or bad, whereas the Old Testament versions were benevolent or good. We do have the technology now to give UFOs, or the electric flying saucers, to the world. It is when I say we, it's a joint scientific effort from many of the countries of the world: Russia, the United States, England, Canada. Now, it is just the manner in which to announce it. What we have here is the tip of the iceberg with the anti-gravity device, the flying saucer we've been discussing. There are many other things that the technology offers. New medicine, which allows limbs to be regrown through electric field processes and plasma research, bioplasma, the tissue restructuring. We have devices which can transmit power around the entire planet without wires, so that you can tune to electricity stations like you would tune to a radio station, but it would run your house or your caravan or wherever you are in the bush or the water or the air. We have theory now, but I don't think any practical devices that would allow us to go faster than the speed of light and traverse many light years of distance in a very, very short time, using the same technique that we used to break the sound barrier, where we warp the shock wave. Perhaps this is where Star Trek developed their terminology, warp factor 1 and warp factor 2. We have devices to make weapons, which is an unfortunate thing. It could be used for other applications, but in transmitting power in little hand or backpack units, or even on tops of the decks of ships that shoot smoke rings or charged particle rings like smoke rings at targets long distances away, and strike them with enough force to electrocute or burn the target, depending upon what frequencies are used. There are numerous things. There is even a way to use this process to control mines at a distance of 10 to 15 miles from a central transmitter, where people aren't even aware of it during their sleep, somewhat like post-hypnotic suggestion. This, in the wrong hands, is not a good tool.